I want you to think about the last time you actually slept through the entire night, woke up with real energy and felt like yourself fully, without needing 3 cups of coffee just to function. If it's been a while, I want you to know something before we go any further. What you're experiencing likely isn't just getting older. It's very possibly connected to a single specific nutrient deficiency that almost nobody checks for, despite how directly it affects nearly everything men over 50 care about. Hi, I'm Dr. Emily Carter. I've spent more than a decade as a urologist, and one of the things that still surprises me, even after all these years, is how often the answer to a man's complaints, low energy, weaker performance, restless nights, traces back to something this simple and this overlooked. Today, I want to walk you through one specific vitamin. Why deficiency becomes so common after 50. What the actual research shows about its connection to erectile function, vitality, and deep restorative sleep, and exactly how to use it correctly, because timing and dosage genuinely matter here. This isn't hype. This is the same conversation I have with patients in my clinic, explained clearly without the marketing noise. If you've never had this explained to you before, stay with me. And if you want more of these honest, research-backed conversations, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because I bring you content like this every week. Let's get into it. The vitamin I'm talking about is vitamin D. And before you assume this is just another rehash of bone health advice, I want you to set that assumption aside completely, because that's a seriously incomplete picture of what this nutrient actually does. Vitamin D functions less like a traditional vitamin and considerably more like a hormone precursor, with receptors found throughout vascular tissue, testicular tissue, and regions of the brain directly involved in mood and sleep regulation. This is precisely why a genuine deficiency rarely shows up as one isolated symptom. It tends to show up as a cluster: fatigue, low mood, poor sleep, and yes, reduced erectile function, symptoms most men never think to connect back to a single underlying cause, simply because nobody's ever laid out the connection clearly. Here's what consistently surprises my patients. Vitamin D deficiency is remarkably widespread in men over 50, and it's becoming more common, not less, largely due to how modern life is structured rather than any specific illness. The primary natural source of vitamin D is sunlight triggering production directly in your skin. As men age, skin becomes measurably less efficient at this conversion process, meaning identical sun exposure that generated adequate vitamin D at 30 produces significantly less at 60. Layer on top of that the reality that most men over 50 spend the overwhelming majority of daylight hours indoors, working, commuting, sitting, and you have a population simultaneously producing less vitamin D per unit of sun exposure while also getting considerably less sun exposure in the first place. Geography compounds this further. Men living at higher latitudes or anywhere with long winters often cannot produce meaningful vitamin D from sunlight for large stretches of the year, regardless of how much time they spend outside. Add in widespread sunscreen use, which is genuinely important for skin cancer prevention, but does measurably reduce vitamin D synthesis, and it becomes clear why population studies consistently find a substantial percentage of men over 50 sitting well below optimal levels, often without symptoms severe enough to prompt anyone to actually test for it. Let's get into what brought most of you here specifically. The research connecting vitamin D to erectile function and overall potency is genuinely compelling, and understanding the underlying mechanism makes it clear why. Erectile function depends fundamentally on healthy blood vessel function, specifically the capacity of blood vessels to relax and permit increased blood flow on demand. Vitamin D plays a direct, measurable role in this process, supporting the health of the endothelium, the thin cellular lining of every blood vessel in your body, and supporting nitric oxide production, the exact molecule targeted by common erectile dysfunction medications, since it's essential for the vascular relaxation response that makes an erection physically possible. Multiple studies examining men with erectile dysfunction have found meaningfully higher rates of vitamin D deficiency compared to men without erectile difficulty. Some research goes further, finding that the severity of vitamin D deficiency correlates with the severity of reported erectile dysfunction, meaning men with more pronounced deficiency tended to report more significant difficulty than men with only mild deficiency. I want to be careful here. This doesn't mean vitamin D deficiency is the sole cause of erectile dysfunction, which frequently has multiple contributing factors: cardiovascular health, blood sugar regulation, testosterone levels, and psychological stress among them. But given how directly vitamin D supports the exact vascular mechanisms erectile function depends on, correcting a genuine deficiency represents one of the more straightforward, low-risk interventions available, and one that's frequently skipped entirely in favor of jumping straight to medication. Vitamin D's relevance doesn't stop at vascular health. It plays a meaningful, well-documented role in testosterone production, specifically connecting directly back to the energy and vitality most men over 50 are hoping to hold on to. Research has consistently found that men with adequate vitamin D levels tend to show measurably higher testosterone levels compared to men who are deficient, and several intervention studies have found that correcting a genuine deficiency through supplementation produced modest but real increases in testosterone over several months. This effect appears most pronounced specifically in men who were deficient to begin with, rather than men who already had adequate levels, an important distinction since supplementing without a genuine deficiency shows considerably less benefit. This is exactly why testing your actual levels, rather than simply assuming you need supplementation, matters. Beyond the direct hormonal connection, vitamin D deficiency is independently linked to fatigue and low energy through its broader role in mitochondrial function, the cellular machinery responsible for generating energy throughout your entire body. Men who correct a genuine deficiency frequently report improved energy within a matter of weeks, sometimes before blood work would even be expected to reflect meaningful change, suggesting the mechanism extends beyond hormones alone. Now here's where timing becomes genuinely important, and where a lot of circulating advice online actually gets things backwards. Vitamin D receptors exist in areas of the brain directly involved in regulating your sleep-wake cycle. And research has found consistent associations between vitamin D deficiency and both poor sleep quality and reduced total sleep duration. This is part of why correcting a deficiency has been linked across multiple studies to improved sleep architecture, including more time spent in the deep, restorative sleep stages that matter most for recovery and hormone regulation. I want to address something directly here because it affects exactly how you should take this. Some research suggests taking vitamin D too close to bedtime may, for certain individuals, interfere with melatonin production, since vitamin D and melatonin share some overlapping regulatory pathways in the brain. This means the common advice to simply take vitamin D right before bed isn't necessarily optimal for everyone. Some men actually report better sleep outcomes taking it earlier in the day, paired with a meal containing some dietary fat to improve absorption, since vitamin D is fat soluble. My practical guidance is this: if you've been taking vitamin D before bed and haven't noticed any negative effect on your sleep, there's no strong reason to change the timing. But if you've noticed any new difficulty falling asleep since starting a nighttime dose, shifting it to morning or early afternoon alongside a meal is a reasonable, easy adjustment worth trying. I always tell my patients that the single most important step here is getting an actual blood test, specifically a 25-hydroxyvitamin D test, rather than assuming deficiency and simply starting a supplement blindly. This test is inexpensive, widely available, and gives you a real specific number to work from rather than guesswork. For men found to be genuinely deficient, typical supplementation protocols range from 1,000 to 4,000 international units daily, though this should always be guided by your specific test results and your doctor's recommendation, since significantly higher doses are sometimes used short-term under medical supervision for more severe deficiency. Taking vitamin D alongside a meal containing some fat meaningfully improves absorption, since it's poorly absorbed on an empty stomach. Retesting after 2 to 3 months of consistent supplementation is a reasonable, worthwhile way to confirm your levels have actually improved, rather than assuming a supplement is working without ever verifying it. I've had patients who assumed a low-dose, over-the-counter product was sufficient, only to retest and discover their levels had barely shifted, requiring a more targeted higher dose adjusted specifically with their doctor's guidance. I want to pause here because addressing foundational deficiencies like this is exactly the kind of thing I built into a complete resource called the Iron Age. It walks through vitamin D alongside every other major lever affecting men's health after 40: testosterone, sleep, strength training, nutrition, stress, and prostate health, with a clear, practical protocol for identifying and correcting exactly these kinds of overlooked gaps. For $49.99, it's less than a single specialist visit and something you can reference for years as you continue optimizing your health. If these videos have brought you real value, I genuinely encourage you to check it out. The link is below. Something practical that trips up a lot of my patients. Not all vitamin D supplements are created equal, and understanding the difference matters for actually correcting a deficiency effectively. Vitamin D supplements generally come in two forms, D2 and D3. Research consistently shows D3, also called cholecalciferol, is meaningfully more effective at raising and maintaining blood levels compared to D2, also called ergocalciferol. Checking specifically for D3 on the label is worth the extra few seconds, since D2 products, while not harmful, tend to require higher doses to achieve the same effect and don't sustain elevated levels as consistently over time. I also generally recommend patients choose reputable brands with third-party testing, since supplement regulation is considerably less rigorous than pharmaceutical regulation, and quality can vary significantly between manufacturers. This doesn't need to mean the most expensive option available, but looking for some indication of third-party verification is worth the small extra effort. Vitamin D doesn't function in isolation. Several other nutrients play supporting roles in how effectively your body actually uses whatever vitamin D you're taking or producing naturally. Magnesium is required for the enzymatic processes that convert vitamin D into its active form. Men simultaneously deficient in magnesium, which is also common, particularly with a diet heavy in processed foods, may find vitamin D supplementation alone produces a less complete response than expected, simply because their body lacks adequate magnesium to fully activate and utilize it. Vitamin K2 also plays a supporting role, helping direct calcium toward bones rather than soft tissue, which becomes more relevant at higher vitamin D doses that increase calcium absorption. This isn't meant to complicate a simple intervention. It's meant to explain why some men report only a partial response to vitamin D alone, and why looking at the broader nutritional picture with your doctor, rather than fixating on one isolated nutrient, tends to produce more complete results. I think it's worth setting honest expectations because supplement marketing often promises immediate dramatic results that simply don't reflect how this works physiologically. For men with a significant confirmed deficiency, meaningful improvement in energy and mood often becomes noticeable within 3 to 6 weeks of consistent, appropriately dosed supplementation. Sleep quality improvements tend to follow a similar timeline, though this varies between individuals depending on what else might be affecting sleep simultaneously. Erectile function improvements tied to the slower process of improving vascular health and endothelial function specifically typically take somewhat longer, often in the range of 2 to 3 months, though some men notice improvement sooner. None of this happens overnight, and vitamin D correction is not a substitute for immediate support if you're dealing with significant distressing erectile dysfunction right now. It's a foundational piece worth addressing alongside whatever more immediate support your doctor recommends, not instead of it. Men who understand this realistic timeline tend to stay consistent long enough to see genuine results rather than giving up after a week or two when marketing promises of instant improvement don't materialize. I also want to address the other end of this conversation directly, because more is not always better, and vitamin D toxicity, while uncommon, is a genuine risk worth understanding. Toxicity typically only occurs with very high doses taken over extended periods, well beyond what's found in standard over-the-counter supplements taken as directed. It becomes a more realistic concern when men take multiple supplements simultaneously without realizing their combined vitamin D content, or when high-dose prescription-strength supplementation isn't properly monitored with follow-up blood work. Symptoms of toxicity, which stem primarily from resulting elevated calcium levels, can include nausea, weakness, and in more severe cases, kidney complications. This is exactly why testing before starting, and retesting periodically once supplementing, genuinely matters. It's not just about confirming the supplement is working. It's about ensuring you're not overshooting into a range that creates its own set of problems. I want to address why this specific deficiency tends to go undiagnosed for years, sometimes decades, longer than it probably should. Vitamin D isn't included in most standard annual blood work panels by default. Unlike cholesterol or blood glucose, checked routinely as part of a general physical, vitamin D typically has to be specifically requested, either by the patient or because a doctor has particular reason to suspect deficiency. This means the overwhelming majority of men simply never get tested unless they specifically ask, regardless of how many symptoms they're experiencing. Compounding this, symptoms of deficiency, fatigue, low mood, poor sleep, reduced libido, overlap heavily with dozens of other common conditions, from low testosterone to depression to simple overwork. This overlap means both patients and physicians often reach for more commonly discussed explanations first, sometimes going through extensive workups for other conditions before anyone thinks to check something as simple as vitamin D. I've had patients go through cardiac workups, sleep studies, and mental health evaluations, all reasonable steps given their symptoms, before a routine blood panel finally revealed significant deficiency as a meaningful, overlooked contributing factor the entire time. Vitamin D levels fluctuate seasonally in a way that genuinely affects how you feel at different points in the year, particularly if you live somewhere with distinct seasons. For most men, levels peak toward the end of summer after months of greater sun exposure and gradually decline through fall and winter, often reaching their lowest point in late winter or early spring. This means many symptoms we've discussed, fatigue, low mood, disrupted sleep, reduced energy, often intensify during these exact months, and men frequently attribute this to general seasonal changes, shorter days, colder weather, without recognizing that an actual measurable drop in a specific nutrient is contributing directly. If you've noticed a pattern where you consistently feel worse during winter specifically, this is worth mentioning directly to your doctor and worth testing during that seasonal low point, rather than only testing in summer when levels are naturally at their highest and might mask a deficiency that becomes significant later in the year. Vitamin D is fat soluble, and this has a significant, often overlooked implication for men carrying excess body fat. Vitamin D gets sequestered in fat tissue, meaning men with higher body fat percentages often have measurably lower circulating vitamin D levels, even with equivalent sun exposure and dietary intake compared to leaner individuals. The vitamin isn't lost. It's stored in fat tissue rather than remaining available in the bloodstream where it can actually be used by the vascular, hormonal, and neurological systems that depend on it. This is precisely why addressing body composition alongside a specific deficiency often produces better results than addressing either factor alone. While supplementation is often the most reliable way to correct a confirmed deficiency, certain foods can meaningfully support your overall vitamin D status alongside whatever protocol your doctor recommends. Fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, and sardines are among the richest natural dietary sources available. Egg yolks contain modest amounts, and many fortified foods, including certain dairy products and cereals, are specifically supplemented with vitamin D during manufacturing precisely because natural dietary sources are so limited to begin with. I don't want to overstate how much impact diet alone can have here. For most men with a significant confirmed deficiency, diet by itself rarely closes the gap quickly enough without supplementation involved. But building a few of these foods into a regular weekly rotation supports your levels over the long term and reduces how quickly you slide back into deficiency once corrected, particularly heading into the lower sunlight months I mentioned earlier in this video. I get asked constantly how much sun exposure is actually needed to meaningfully support natural production, and this deserves a direct answer, since the truth isn't as simple as more is better for most men. Roughly 10 to 20 minutes of midday sun exposure on a reasonable amount of exposed skin, arms, and legs, for example, several times per week during sunnier months, supports meaningful natural production for many people. This varies considerably based on skin tone, latitude, and season, and I'm not suggesting men abandon sun protection altogether, since skin cancer risk is a genuinely serious consideration that shouldn't be dismissed in pursuit of a single nutrient. The practical takeaway is balance. Brief, unprotected exposure during lower risk periods of the day combined with normal sun protection during longer or more intense exposure allows for reasonable natural production without meaningfully increasing skin cancer risk. For men in climates or seasons where consistent sun exposure isn't realistic, which describes a large percentage of the population for a significant part of the year, supplementation becomes the more reliable, consistent solution rather than something to feel like you're failing at through diet and sun exposure alone. I also want to mention something I see overlooked constantly in my practice, because it directly intersects with everything we've discussed tonight: undiagnosed sleep apnea. Sleep apnea, particularly common in men over 50, especially those carrying excess weight around the neck and midsection, disrupts the deep restorative sleep stages we've been discussing throughout this video. The same stages where vitamin D receptor activity in the brain plays a meaningful regulatory role. Men with undiagnosed sleep apnea often experience persistent fatigue and poor sleep quality that supplementation alone won't fully resolve, simply because the underlying mechanical disruption to their breathing during sleep remains unaddressed. If you snore heavily, wake up gasping, or regularly feel unrested despite spending adequate time in bed, even after addressing vitamin D status directly, this is worth raising with your doctor as a separate, parallel possibility. The two issues, vitamin D deficiency and sleep apnea, frequently coexist in the same patient population, and addressing both together tends to produce considerably more complete improvement than addressing either one alone. Chronic stress also interacts directly with everything we've covered tonight, and it's worth understanding this connection specifically. Elevated cortisol from ongoing unmanaged stress has been shown in research to interfere with vitamin D metabolism, potentially reducing how effectively your body converts and utilizes available vitamin D, even when intake or supplementation is adequate. This creates a frustrating cycle worth being aware of. Chronic stress can worsen sleep quality directly, worsen vitamin D utilization, and independently suppress testosterone, meaning a man dealing with significant ongoing stress may find that vitamin D supplementation alone produces a less complete response than expected, simply because an unaddressed stressor is working against several of the same systems simultaneously. This is exactly why I emphasize across nearly every video on this channel that these systems don't operate in isolation. Addressing sleep, stress, and specific nutrient deficiencies together, rather than chasing a single intervention in isolation, consistently produces better, more complete results. I want to walk you through a fairly typical pattern I see clinically, because I think it illustrates how this often unfolds in practice rather than in theory. A patient in his late 50s comes in describing fatigue, difficulty sleeping through the night, and a noticeable decline in both energy and function that he's assumed is simply unavoidable at his age. Basic blood work reveals significant vitamin D deficiency, well below optimal range. We discuss appropriate supplementation, D3 specifically, taken with a meal, At a dose calibrated to his specific deficiency level, along with a conversation about consistent sun exposure, where reasonable and dietary sources to build in alongside it. At the 6-week mark, he typically reports noticeable improvement in energy, sometimes describing it as the first time in years he hasn't felt like he was running on empty by mid-afternoon. Sleep improvements often follow shortly after, sometimes reported as falling asleep more easily or waking less frequently through the night. Changes in erectile function tied to the slower process of vascular improvement tend to be reported later, often around the 2 to 3 month mark, and are frequently described as a gradual, noticeable shift rather than a sudden, dramatic change. I share this pattern because I think it's genuinely useful to know what a realistic trajectory looks like, rather than either expecting instant results or assuming nothing is happening simply because change hasn't been immediate. I'll close this section with something I tell every patient starting this kind of intervention. The men who see the most complete, lasting improvement are, without exception, the ones who stayed consistent through the full timeline, rather than the ones who took a supplement for 2 weeks, didn't notice a dramatic shift, and quietly stopped. This isn't a fast-acting intervention in the way a medication might be. It's a foundational correction that supports multiple interconnected systems gradually, and giving it the genuine time it needs, typically a minimum of 2 to 3 months before drawing firm conclusions, makes the difference between men who see real, lasting change and men who dismiss something that would have genuinely helped them if they'd simply stayed the course a little longer. So here's what I want you to walk away with. Vitamin D deficiency is remarkably common in men over 50, driven largely by reduced sun exposure, less efficient skin conversion with age, and modern indoor lifestyles. Correcting a genuine deficiency has real research behind it, supporting improved erectile function through better vascular health, improved vigor through both hormonal and cellular mechanisms, and deeper, more restorative sleep through its role in brain regulation. This isn't a miracle cure, and it doesn't replace addressing other foundational habits or underlying medical conditions. But it's one of the most overlooked, inexpensive, low-risk interventions available, and getting a simple blood test to check your actual levels is worth doing rather than guessing. If this was useful, let me know in the comments whether you've ever had your vitamin D levels checked. Subscribe if you want more honest, research-backed conversations about men's health like this one. I'll see you in the next video.